just before the commencement of World War II. On the 2nd of August 1939, Albert Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt of the United States informing him of the developing technology of nuclear energy in Germany. A technology that Nazis could use to construct a new bomb which Einstein believed could cause terrible destruction and devastation. On the 6th of December 1941, a day before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt authorized what became known as the Manhattan Project. It was a top-secret project involving in all some 120,000 people over 3 years and costing an equivalent in today's terms of $24 billion. Of those tens of thousands of people involved, only a few dozen knew what they were working on. The Manhattan Project operated under blanket-tight security. It was a crucial war secret. The race was on to develop and eventually use the secret resource designed to potentially achieve over the enemy. By July 1945, the Army's top secret was ready for use. A new superweapon, a secret resource like none other available to the forces. Japan would never surrender, and having calculated the enormity of the casualty costs if they invaded Japan, in August 1945 the order was given to drop 2 atomic bombs. One over Hiroshima and another over Nagasaki. When that secret resource, when that super weapon was used, the war came to an end. Or, we could say, victory was secured. Friends, as we return this morning to Ephesians 6, we are considering the soldier's secret resource. Not an atomic bomb, obviously. But we know that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they are mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. As Christians, God has given to us, nevertheless, a super weapon. He has given to us a secret resource like no other available to other people. So what is the Christian soldier's secret resource? Well, it's what Paul speaks about in Ephesians 6 and verse 18. It is all prayer. John Bunyan, the famous Puritan, says, weapon in the storehouse of God is the weapon of prayer. The Christian soldier's secret resource, then, is the spiritual weapon of prayer. It's a super weapon in God's storehouse. When the Christian soldier uses this secret resource, this spiritual weapon, in conjunction with having on all the whole armour of God, skillfully wielding the sword of the Spirit, victory is assured. Consider with me then, friends, this morning the soldier's secret resource. With me of the 4 things that emerge from verse 18. That's our focus this morning. Ephesians 6 verse 18. Look with me back at the verse. 4 things here that we'll see. Praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, being watchful to this end with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints. The 4 things are its necessity, its frequency, its variety, and its quality. Think with me of its necessity. When we look there at verse 18, you will notice how verse 17 finishes. Verse 17 concludes with a comma. We haven't got to know much grammar to tell us that that's actually communicating something to us. Well, what Paul is saying in verse 18 is still what he has been talking about in verse 17 in the previous verses. He's still speaking about the spiritual war that we are in when he verse 18. Verse 18 commences not with a capital letter. It's not the start of a new sentence, a new paragraph, new concept. It's the still flow of the same thought. And so having just spoken about the sword of the Spirit, which we were looking at last week, Paul goes on now to speak about something else that is just as, in fact, it is necessary in our fight against Satan and against sin. In the year 778, there was a great military disaster in the Middle Ages. The defeat of the Knights of Charlemagne. And what makes the story so striking in terms of its sadness, is that the defeat was unnecessary. Roland, the commander of the Charlemagne's rear guard, could have called for help from the main body of army merely by sounding his horn. But he would not do it. Pride held him back. And because he failed to call upon his secret resource, Roland's troops, sadly, were massacred. And so in a similar way, not as dramatic, but in a similar way, many Christians can trace the reason for a defeated life as a Christian. They can trace it really to prayerlessness. Prayer is absolutely necessary in our spiritual warfare. If you look back with me at verse 12, where we are reminded how powerful our enemy is. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood. Who is it that we're fighting against? Paul says it's against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. And as we've seen in our previous studies, we know that our enemy, all of his with him, they are very cruel. They are very clever. And they are competent due to their centuries of experience in attacking Christians. And so in our own strength, we are simply no match for our enemy. That's a super weapon. It is necessary for us to use this because prayerlessness leads to defeat. There is something as we come to verse 18 that we need to understand. The two main words that Paul uses there that are, if you like, in a grammatical sense, praying and watching. Those two words in the grammar are actually connected back to the command in verse 14. I want to get into the technicalities, but they're connected back to verse 14, to the command in verse 14. Remember what the command was? It starts the whole thing about the armour. The command is, you are to stand. On the basis of all these issues of your conflict, you are to stand, and I've provided you with this armour, God says. And so what Paul is saying in verse 18 about praying and watching is connected to the command to stand. In other words, put it this way, we are not able to stand against the devil and his attacks upon us without us not only putting on the whole armour, but we must also be praying if we would ever stand in the battle. We are fighting, he says, against spiritual hosts of wickedness. And to defeat spiritual hosts, it is necessary for us to have a spiritual weapon. And that's what God has put in our hands. It's a super weapon in the war. Prayer is that weapon. Now, what is prayer? Well, we could ask that question maybe to some of the children who have learned the catechism and know the question and the answer. And prayer is talking to God, is often the answer given from the children's catechism. That's a good answer. It's a simple answer. It's a straightforward answer. We can all understand that. Prayer is God. Well, one writer has put it this way, thinking of the whole warfare picture, he says this, he says, prayer is the walkie-talkie in the battlefield of this world. I'd like us to think about that this morning. I'd like to use that. That's a helpful thing as we think about the passage that we're in a war. What is prayer? It's our walkie-talkie as we're in the battlefield of this world. What does prayer do? Well, prayer connects us with He who is all-powerful. Prayer is, if you like, the communication with headquarters by which the weapons of our warfare are done. Prayer is the Christian soldier's secret resource. Prayer is needed in even putting the armour on. George Duffield got that right, I believe, when he wrote that well-known hymn. We all know it. Stand up for Jesus, stand in his strength alone. The ash will fail you. You dare not trust your own. Put on the gospel armour, each piece put on with prayer. Where duty calls or danger, he never wanting there. By having the lines of communication open with our captain, who is the master tactician, he enables us to know how to live victoriously as we wrestle with demonic forces, as we are dressed in all of our armour. Have you got the connection? I'm labouring, but have you got the connection that Paul himself is making in the passage? This is Paul's point, it's not mine. I'm just trying to help. The Christian soldier must have on all the armour that God supplies. We've seen that in recent weeks. The belt, he must have the breastplate, the boots, he must have the shield and the helmet. They must be all securely in place. They must be all rightly used, including the skillful use of the sword of the Spirit and in his attack. But having all the armour on is not enough. That's what Paul's saying. If you and I are ever to stand, we must make use of our secret resource, this super weapon, or our walkie-talkie. We must use that out on the battlefield. Now, to illustrate this, go to the Old Testament. Turn with me, please, in your Bibles to 1 Chronicles chapter 5. 1 Chronicles chapter 5. Several weeks ago, I've personally been reading through the book of Chronicles. I'm into 2 Chronicles now, privately. But I came across this verse, thing to do with sermon preparation. It just jumped out at me. And I've realised this is a wonderful illustration of what we're looking at this morning. 1 Chronicles chapter 5 from verse 18. The sons of Reuben and Gadites and half the tribe of Manasseh had 44,700 valiant men. How are they described? Men able to bear shield and sword, to shoot with the bow, and skillful in war, who went to war. They made war with the Hagrites, Jetur, Naphish, and Nodab. And they were helped against them, and the Nagrites were delivered into their hand, and all who were with them. Why? For they cried out to God in the battle. He heeded their prayer, because they put their trust in him. Then they took away their livestock, 1,000 of their camels, 250,000 of their sheep, and 2,000 of their donkeys, and also 100,000 of their men, for many fell dead, because the war was God's, and they dwelt in their place until the captivity. It was a physical battle. Ours is a spiritual battle. But the point is, these 44,760 men, as verse 18 tells us, they were skilled in war. That they were able to use their shield. They were very good at sword. They were great archers. They could use their bows and their arrows. They had practice. They were honed in those skills. They were skillful at war. But ultimately, that's not how they won the battle. Verse 20 says that they cried out to God in the battle. Not just before the battle. In the midst of the battle, they put their trust in him. It says at the end of verse 20. They didn't put their trust in their skillful use of their shield and their sword. They didn't put their trust, if you like, fully in the armour either. What did they do? They got on the walkie-talkie and they called in the super weapon of all, prayer. When you look at how many they took captive, and you see how big their army was, that they shouldn't have won. They had a powerful enemy. But friends, the enemy that we fight is far more powerful, it is far more numerous and experienced, far more than these Hagrites. And so 1 Chronicles 5, these verses here only illustrates what Paul wants us to see in Ephesians 6:18 about prayer. Its necessity in warfare. Let me ask then a most basic question, and it is basic. Do you pray? Told you it was basic. Do you pray? I'm not asking, do you say prayers? That's not the same thing. Do you actually pray? Do you get through? You might try and use your walkie-talkie, but maybe it's broken. What I mean by that is that the communication line between you and God is broken. You're not in range, we could say today. Or you actually have no reception in heaven because you're not right with God. 66 verse 18 says, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear. David is saying sin is what blocks the reception of our words in heaven. Sin stops our word getting through. John 9:31 says, we know that God does not hear sinners. John 9:31. So how's anyone saved? Well, we could put it this way, and often it has been put this way, that the first prayer that God hears, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. But until that prayer, our walkie-talkie is broken. And most often we don't even want to try to pray. We're not bothered to attempt to pray. Describing you, I want you to think of what it will be for you in death, when the door of mercy is forever shut and you begin to feel judgment. How you will every moment curse yourself for your folly, for neglecting prayer. You remember that heaven with all of its glory was open to you, and all you had to do was to ask for it on the basis of God's mercy, but you wouldn't give yourself to the trouble to call on God's name. But listen to what God promises. He's promising this, and it's a promise right now, and it will open your way to get through to heaven. Romans 10 verse 31 says, whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Isn't that a wonderful promise? Whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. It means if you don't call on the name of the Lord, you won't be saved. No one drifts into heaven because their parents are saved, or their brother or their sister is saved. You don't cruise into heaven because you must call on the name of the Lord. Lord, save me. And when you call on the Lord's name to save you, that is the prayer that He will hear. That is the one, if you like, that is the first one that gets through. Hebrews 5 is another wonderful promise. It says, He is able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through Him, through Christ. What about those of us, which is the most of us, who are already saved? We're in a spiritual battle, remember, as we've seen in recent weeks. So ask the question, is this the main reason why some of us are limping along in our walk with God? Why we are so easily defeated by Satan? Is this why ours is not really a victorious life for our Lord? Because we've dropped the walkie-talkie out in the battlefield. We become an easy prey for Satan, and we lack the joy in our Christian life, and it's because we fail to use the super weapon God's put in our hands. Friends, coming back to Ephesians 6, if we would ever experience and know obedience to the words that Paul has previously said earlier in the passage, if we are going to be able to be those who are standing victoriously in this evil day, we must see the necessity of prayer. Secondly, and let's move more quickly now, I'd like us to think as we come back to Ephesians 6, its frequency. Look back at verse 18 with me, friends. It starts by Paul simply saying, praying always. How often is always? That's a really simple question. It's got a really simple answer. Always is always. It is always. That's what always is. Always never finishes. Always is always. Luke 18 verse 1 said, always ought to pray and not lose heart. And what Luke is telling us here before he goes on and records Jesus' parables about continuing in prayer, he's basically saying, don't stop praying, otherwise you'll want to give up. Stop praying, you'll lose heart. Don't stop praying, it'll seem hopeless if you do. Don't stop praying and it'll just become all too much. No prayer, no hope. And so Luke says men ought to pray always. We know Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians 5, they're famous about this, that little verse, the one that everyone knows, the easiest memory verse to learn, right? Pray without ceasing. Its frequency? Here Paul simply says in this verse, praying always. In other words, think about the walkie-talkie. Don't turn the walkie-talkie off, or don't put the walkie-talkie down. Keep the lines of communication constantly open with headquarters. You need to always, he's saying, to be ready to receive fresh instruction from your captain, or to get counsel that you need in the heat of the battle when you are coming under intense mortar attack from the enemy. You need to be in communication with captain. Obviously, when Paul says the Christian soldier is to be always praying, he means something different to just stated seasons of or formal prayers. Obviously he does. He means something far more pervasive than when the little child closes his eyes and puts his hands together to pray. Something more than when we ourselves might meet together for a time of prayer. Something in mind here that is broader than that. As much as those things are part of this, they are not all of this. You see, the battlefield of spiritual warfare is wherever we are. At home, at work, in the car, on holiday, in the train, wherever we are. Paul is speaking then about a life pattern here. Praying always. This is a consciousness of God's presence at all times when my heart is open fully to my Lord. Actually, the frequency of communication is highlighting a relationship, isn't it? Not a religious ritual. It's not what Paul's talking about. The Christian soldier is one who is in a personal relationship with his captain. He's not just a number, like your number soldier 224, and there's no personal connection. It may be the real military, but it's not the Lord's army. There's a personal relationship between the soldier and his captain, and the walkie-talkie is to be always on, so that we can be in communication with our captain who we have a relationship with. It's part of being in a relationship. It's a matter of communication. And so Paul is saying the lines of communication are always open so I can receive the help that I need wherever I am having to deal with the devil. The devil doesn't just stay in one place. The Bible tells us that he has thousands of demons who are working for him. We have reason to state that the devil is at church, snatching away the word. He's not just down at the pub. Yes, he comes to church. He will attack us everywhere, anywhere. He'll attack us at home, in our marriage relationship. He loves to attack relationships between Christians. He loves to rage against churches. He loves to bring isolation. He delights to inflame pride, which of course is his ancient sin. He shoots his arrows of flaming fire at young people when they're at university, or when they're at college, or when they're at school, when they're away from the oversight and help of their parents. When you think no one else is watching, when you're online, he shoots flaming arrows. What does God give us? To enable us to stand. Praying always. Prayer is effectively us having heart submission to God and His ways. Living our lives under the captain's leadership. Having hearts of submission to Him and all of His ways. Prayer is the Christian's secret resource to resist the devil. The world knows nothing about this. It can understand some things of what we believe. It doesn't understand this. It knows about saying prayers, but it doesn't know about praying always, because it is a relationship, and it's a relationship that's connected ultimately with our hearts being in submission to our captain and our Saviour. The connection that James makes. Remember that connection? We saw this some weeks ago. In James 4, he says, submit to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. That the fleeing of the devil comes only after the heart is in submission to God. And the evidence that our hearts are in submission to God is our maintaining this frame of heart of constant prayerfulness. So there's its frequency. Let's move on and think about its variety. And here we see there's so many things sort of packed in here in this verse. It's trying to just unpack them quickly. Where he says in verse 18, praying always with all prayer and supplication. Now what does he mean when he says all prayer and supplication? Paul actually is using two different words here in the Greek. He doesn't have a stutter. Like he's not just being wasteful with his words, he's being very particular and careful with what he's saying. He wants us to understand how marvellous and how flexible the soldier's secret resource is. And so he chooses two words to help us understand that. And the first word of these two words is this word prayer. It is that broad general word for prayer in the Bible. And he says all prayer. That is all kinds of prayer. There are kinds of prayer, aren't there? I mean, you stop and think about it. There can be private prayer, there can be family prayer, there can be corporate prayer, there's public prayer, there's oral prayer or verbal prayer, there's silent prayer or mental prayer, there's planned seasons of prayer, there's spontaneous prayer, there's unplanned prayer. There are those ejaculatories when you're in that sticky situation and you shoot a prayer request up to God. Remember like Nehemiah did when he was face to face with King Artaxerxes? There's prayers of thanks, there's prayers of confession, there's requests to God, there's expressions of humiliation in prayer, there's praise, there's adoration, and on and on we can go. Kind of prayer for every kind of emotion, for every kind of thinking, for every kind of circumstance in our life. Here's the wonder and the power for the Christian soldier. We can pray all kinds of prayer that can fit every twist and turn in the midst of our spiritual warfare, which really wear us down. What's prayer? It's our super weapon, and we've got all kinds of prayers available to us. Then Paul uses his second word, supplication, or maybe it's petitions in your translation, or requests. This term is more specific. It relates to the special times of need or those requests arising from a particular issue. And so there's the Christian soldier. He's out in the thick of the battle, and maybe he's at work. He's on the building site and he's surrounded by pornographic images in the lunchroom. Or maybe it's a Christian lady and she's in the lunchroom and there's words of gossip and criticism that are flying around. And what does the Christian do? You get on the walkie-talkie and you shoot up a specific request to your captain. Lord, help me right now. Not to engage in their activity. Lord, with Job I have made a covenant. With my eyes I will not look there. Have you not said, be quick to listen and slow to speak? Did you not say in Proverbs 18, a fool's lips enter into contention, a fool's mouth is his destruction, words of slander are tasty trifles? You did say that, Lord. But did you also say in that same chapter, the name of the Lord is a strong tower, the righteous run to it and are safe? Specific petitions for specific needs. Our super weapon is marvellously flexible. It's not just one press of the button in Enola Gray, the name of that first plane, and the dropping of what they call Little Boy. It's not just that basic and just one thing. There's marvellous flexibility with the super weapon. There is variety in prayer according to the need that we might have out on the battlefield. It's a wonderful provision. Fourthly and finally, as we think of this super weapon this morning, it's quality. What does Paul then go on to say? And let me just run these things together as we see the quality that he speaks about. He says, "In supplication in the Spirit, being watchful to this end with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints." Trying to keep it simple, so even the children can follow. A walkie-talkie. Maybe some of you have had them as toys. They're great to play with. Prayer is our spiritual talkie. It has one main band or frequency for which we can reach God. Yes, our prayers are to go through, and they can only go through Christ. But they must also be, what does Paul say? In the Spirit. Okay. What's he mean now by saying praying in the Spirit? This is not about a mystical feeling. It's not talking about, I've got the arm tingles, so I must be praying in the Spirit. This is not code language for speaking in tongues. Paul's words mean in or by the Spirit. Our prayers there are to be under the influence of the Holy Spirit, with His assistance in His strength and by His power. There are times, we all know this as Christians, times when we sense that we are under severe attack from the enemy's incoming arrows. Whether it's because of a trial, whether it's because of some relationship issue, whether it's our own personal struggles, whatever it be, we go through those times of that sense of severe attack. And you know what it's like. It's like that soldier out and the mortars are blowing and there's bombs going off and there's bullets flying past. We're dazed. We're confused. We're not even sure what to think. We're not even sure how to go about what we should do, or we just find it so hard as Christians in those situations even to pray the right words. Paul says pray in the Spirit. And Paul talks about something of this in Romans 8:26 when he says the Spirit helps us in our weaknesses. For we don't know what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit Himself, intercession for us, groanings which cannot be uttered. Praying in and by the Spirit means our prayers will get through. Even when we as a soldier are struggling to know how to use the walkie-talkie, the Spirit comes. When that soldier is out on the battlefield and all the bullets are flying past his ears, he must always be something else according to what Paul says. He must also be watchful. He must be alert even when he's got the walkie-talkie in operation. Just because you're on the line to headquarters, that doesn't mean that the enemy's going to put his arms down and say, we better leave him alone at the moment. He's got to talk to his captain. No, in fact, if anything, if they know that we are on the line, they might see that they have a greater chance to land one on us. And so the Christian soldier must always be alert, even while praying. See the connection. Being watchful to this end with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints. Jesus, our captain, says, watch and pray that you do not enter into temptation. He says you are to pray with watchfulness. You are to watch with prayerfulness. If you're not watching and you're not praying together, you're going to fall into Satan's many temptations. One of those flying bullets is going to hit you. He then says at the end there, pray with perseverance. Don't give up. Don't hang up. Keep the line open. When it seems even that no one's listening, keep the line open. If you have an urgent need and you've got to contact someone on the phone and you ring them and it just rings out, you've got an urgent need and you need to talk to that person, you're just going to give up? Of course you're not. You're going to try again. You're going to try again. You're going to try the mobile. You're going to try again and again. Pray with perseverance. And then specifically, who does Paul say we should be praying for? And this may be a surprise. Not so much even about yourself, he says. Who does he say at the end of the verse? And a supplication for all the saints. Helpful. Very helpful. A true soldier in a real war does not only think of himself. He looks out for his whole unit. He knows he's part of a battalion. And they must be covering one another. They must be helping one another in the battle if they are not only to survive, but if they are to win. They together form one army. The success of one is in the end the success of all. Christians are united in one army. We have a common cause, we fight under the same banner, we get our orders from the one captain, and we need to be using the secret resource to support our fellow troops. But what does Satan do? Well, he uses persecution, he uses even disease to oppress. Job was weighed down under Satan's attacks. When that happens, what do? We pray for our fellow soldiers oppressed. Lord, have you not said no temptation has overtaken us except as is common to man? But God is faithful, who will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we are able, but will make a way of escape that we may be able to bear it. Oh Lord, help my fellow Christian, my Christian friend, to take up the whole armour of God so that she can stand, so that he can stand in this evil day for them. What does the devil do? Well, he moves men to pride and lies and immorality. He did so with the great David. He did so with Ananias and Sapphira. So what do we do? Did you not teach us to pray? Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil and the evil one. Stand therefore, having girded your waist with truth. Help this my fellow soldier to stand as a soldier of the cross. You see, Paul assumes the Christians that he's writing to in Ephesus would not only pray for each other in their own church, but it's broader than that, isn't it? He's assuming that they will pray for God's people elsewhere. That they would be praying for the battalion of God's people over in Colossae, or across in Philippi, or Berea, or Corinth, or down in Jerusalem. He says, for all the saints. And as most of you know, this is something that we do take seriously as a congregation. It's why we regularly pray for other churches. And so as we bring it to an end, what does God say to us this morning from this verse, friends? Here is the Christian soldier's secret resource. This is our super weapon. For the weapons of our warfare, they are not carnal. They are mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. And so let us constantly use the walkie-talkies that He's given us. Always in contact with our captain so that we might be able to stand. So the soldiers might also be able to stand and not fall under the real attacks of the enemy that is coming in upon them, maybe in greater fierceness that it's coming in upon us at the moment. How are we going to stand against the devil? We must put on the whole armour of God. And we must pray with the due frequency and quality that we are told of here. These are our orders. Will we obey? These are our orders. This is how we live victoriously despite the devil's wicked, cruel and consistent attacks. We cannot do it in our own. Let's be like those men in Chronicles. Skilled in war, whilst crying to God in the battle that the Spirit may come and that He may put strength into our legs. Strength into our every stride for Him. For the battle's not ours, it's the Lord's. And we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us. I ask that you would pray with me now. Let's bow.